to the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. My name is Alessandro Arduino, and I'm Principal Research Fellow at MEI. Today, I'm extremely glad to have with us two experts and two very prolific writers that have been focusing their research on Central Asia, Afghanistan, and counterterrorism. Welcome, Antonio Giustozzi and Raffaello Pantucci.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Antonio Giustozzi holds a PhD in International Relations from the LSE and a Bachelor in Contemporary History from the University of Bologna, the alma mater. He was at the Crisis State Research Center in LSE, and he served with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan and is currently also affiliated with RSIS. He is a very prolific writer, and his most recent books are Quran, Kalashnikov, and Laptop, The Taliban at War, and the Islamic State in Khorasan. Raffaello Pantucci, also associated at RSIS, is a senior fellow at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Study here in Singapore at NTU. And we are really looking forward to present in the following month his new book that is going to be published with Oxford University Press, Sinostan, China Inadvertent Empire, looking at Chinese interest in Central Asia. Antonio and Raffaello, welcome again to be with us today in this discussion on the Islamic State in Khorasan Province. As I just mentioned, Antonio, you published the book Islamic State in Khorasan in 2018, if I recall correct. And in this book, you trace the evolution of the movement of fighters of founding from Syria to Afghanistan. Since you wrote this book, how the relationship between Islamic State in Syria and in Afghanistan has evolved? The floor is yours, Antonio.
Well, for sure, there is a relationship. The Islamic State in Khorasan, certainly in recent times, it's difficult, you cannot really figure out in real time where the fund is coming from. There's always a lag, however much you investigate, you're not going to find out within weeks. It takes normally probably months to realize whether new sources of funding have turned up. So in this very moment, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that 2, 3, 4 months ago, the overwhelming source of funding was the caliphate, the central leadership of the Islamic State operating from the Middle East. In fact, the finance center of the Islamic State now is Turkey, where, from where they operate, where they send the money, where they keep the money. And the money is coming definitely from there. They have a little bit of tax raising, that is going on, but to be honest, they don't raise a lot because they don't control much. They can get some money occasionally from some smugglers, but even the smugglers, why would they pay the Islamic State when, they are holed up in some remote valleys in the mountains? There is no particular reason for supporting them. So I would say probably 80% or so of the money comes from the caliphate, and that also gives the caliphate a leverage. They pay, but of course they're in a position to dictate the line. And certainly the cadre of the Islamic State that we talked to were not the most senior people, but say in the middle ranks. They do say that the current governor, Al-Muhajir, who is actually a Pakistani, who was naturalized as Iraqi when he was living under the caliphate, has been imposed by the leadership. That in the past, the previous governors were all people chosen by the Khorasan branch. That internal discussion, often quite turbulent discussions. And in fact, the trend was towards more and more internal disagreements over the personality, the choice of the governor. And that's probably the reason why in the end, the caliphate decided to impose its own candidate. When Aslan Farouki, the previous one, was captured, there was no agreement, again, within the Khorasan branch about who should succeed him. The different components, the candidates, the Pakistanis had some names. The Afghans had some other names, and the Central Asian didn't like either of them. So, they couldn't agree with each other, and the Caliphate decided, okay, we decide for you. And actually probably was a good thing, from the point of view of the Khorasan branch, maybe not for many other people beyond that, because Al-Mujahir has been a bit better than his predecessor in kind of, trying to keep the Khorasan branch united. There are real tensions that there have been, I think, always between the different national and ethnic components. And not only ethnic, because, Afghan Pashtun and Pakistani Pashtuns in reality don't seem to get along that much within Khorasan. And they have different views. It's a bit of a paradox, the Islamic State is dominated, the Khorasan branch, by Pakistanis, even if largely operates in Afghanistan. By now, actually, the Islamic State in Khorasan should be renamed Islamic State in Afghanistan, because Khorasan, there's not much left. Now you have Wilayat Pakistan, Wilayat Hind, you have separate sub-branches in Central Asia and Iran. So, basically, they only really nominally control operation in Afghanistan. But basically, I think money gives leverage to the Islamic State, central leadership. Apart from that, they have constant communication. There's not a lot of exchange of personnel. Even Al-Mujahir, it took him several months before he could make it to Afghanistan from Syria, where he was. So it's obvious, it's not so easy for them to travel. Of course, he was a relatively senior figure, therefore probably travel was particularly problematic for him. But even for the average member, who doesn't have a known profile to the security agencies, it takes easily 3 months to move between Afghanistan and the Middle East. They have to take very long tours, So that, of course, complicates the relationship. It's not possible for the Caliphate, even if they wanted to send a lot of cards to kind of enforce, his own template or whatever. Probably we are talking about more like, maximum low tens of movements per month, usually even less. So basically, if in a year they get 200-300 arrivals or departures, is already quite a lot by their standards.
Thank you, Antonio. You make a very interesting point. You mentioned also the presence of cadres of Islamic State in Central Asia. I'm sure you refer to Tajikistan and also in Iran, and I will come back asking more questions on the topic. But now, talking about Central Asia, I want to move to Rafaelo. Since the fall of Kabul, Central Asian country, especially the one that share a border with Afghanistan, and I mean Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, but also quite near Uzbekistan, share a common and increasing anxiety on what is going to happen if there is going to be a spillover of violence. Some countries like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan try to have some kind of economic cooperation, looking at the fact that an economic collapse of Afghanistan is going to create new wave of migrants and, of course, of insecurity spreading in Central Asia. But Tajikistan opted for a different way, starting to have at least 2 quite important war games with Russia. But now the floor is yours, Raffaello, and looking at from the Central Asia perspective.
Well, first, let me thank you, Alessandro, and colleagues at MEI for the kind invitation to join you by video link across town here in Singapore. And it's delightful to be on a panel with Antonio, who is really a true expert on Afghanistan, ISK in particular. On Central Asia, I think, broadly speaking, Central Asians were not particularly ecstatic at the fall of Kabul to the Taliban so quickly. I think we've seen since then that they've all sort of decided that they're going to try to live with the situation in different ways. If we look at the border countries directly, so Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, we can see each of them have taken a slightly different path. The Turkmen have leaned very heavily into their relationship with the Taliban. This was something that in many ways Ashgabat had signaled pre the fall of Kabul. And in fact, the Taliban have had a relatively positive, or at least functioning relationship with the Taliban, with Ashgabat for some time. It was long suspected that there's been some transit back and forth across those borders. And there's even been discussion at various points that the Taliban were going to explore opening some sort of representative offices in Ashgabat. And the Turkmen government has offered themselves as sort of broker between the former republic government and the Taliban at various moments in time. So, when Kabul fell, and even before, we could see that Turkmen have leaned very heavily into their relationship with the Taliban and have spoken very quickly about trying to reactivate the economic links that should naturally exist between those two countries. If we look instead at Uzbekistan, we can see that the Uzbeks started off with a slightly more skeptical view. And I think if you'd visited Tashkent any time over the past few years, you would see that the Uzbeks were, on the one hand, recognizing that, the Taliban seemed to be coming to a position of power and influence, but you could also see a high level of concern from their perspective about how that might play out and what that might actually mean. So what I think you see from their perspective is a willingness to kind of lean in to build a relationship with the Taliban, operating on the assumption that this is now a kind of de facto government that they share a border with, and therefore they need to have some sort of a functioning relationship with, if they do not want to see a sort of, a total collapse, a sort of closure of an important border for them, and, potential for instability to, affect their immediate region. But at the same time, we've seen them strengthening their direct borders and also work with elements of the former regime to help them, for example, flee from the country and sort of get out to the west. And then if we look over to Tajikistan, we can see the Tajiks taking the completely opposite approach, which is instead to offer themselves as something of a home for any kind of resistance, and particularly the Northern Alliance resistance that had made up a good chunk of the former government that was ruling Kabul before the Taliban took over, and has offered itself quite openly as a home for these groups and for these factions, and has made no pretense of the fact that they are willing to support them in many ways against the Taliban. At the same time, the government in Tajikistan has maintained a relationship with the Taliban, including economic links in terms of sending electricity and in terms of, continuing to allow sort of back and forth of borders and trying to see if there's ways of engaging in a way to kind of reduce tensions. And this is something they've done particularly through the Pakistanis, who are kind of, I think, the Taliban's key international interlocutor. But I think the important thing to think about within these kind of immediate relations is the backdrop. And to look at the backdrop really stretches beyond concerns around ISK. And the backdrop for the Central Asians is that pre-September 11, all of these countries had faced, the exception here is Turkmenistan, where it's very difficult to know exactly what was ever going on because of the very closed nature of the country, both pre-9/11 and subsequently. But if we look at all the other countries, they'd had large-scale incidents of terrorism or instability or violence that had links to Afghanistan. Now, it's important to note that the links that they had were not so much to the kind of Pashtun community and group that really make up the Taliban, but was more to other kind of fellow travelers of the Taliban, if you will, who often operated under kind of Taliban protection or used territory or camps that the Taliban would, let them use in their territory to try to launch attacks in kind of Central Asia. So there's kind of a long history of this potential instability in Central Asia that they've been worried about. But the important point to note about this is that from their perspective, this instability actually didn't necessarily link directly to the Taliban. It was a case of the Taliban offering these people protection. And in some cases, these groups had fought very closely with the Taliban over time. But it was really the fact that, it was these other kind of Central Asian groups that would operate under the kind of in Taliban protection. And why this is important to note is because then if we trace this forward to the ISKP threat. Now, ISK is interesting because ISK sells itself as a pan-regional movement. This is not, in many ways, the Taliban, and here I very much defer to Antonio's knowledge on the subject, but the Taliban are really a Pashtun movement, fundamentally. They have sort of other elements within them, but this is fundamentally an organization that comes from the Pashtun community in Afghanistan. Whereas ISK sells itself as a kind of a much more part of a global brand of the Islamic State, which started in the Levant, but has since grown to be this kind of organization with all these branches and links all over the place, with ISKP being now a particularly prominent element. So it's an organization that has a narrative that's appealing to a kind of a more pan-regional grouping, which means that you could see kind of Central Asian groups and factions who maybe are unhappy working under the Taliban, or are more interested in the kind of more globalist narrative that ISK offers, would find that quite attractive. And so from their perspective, ISK growing as a threat in Afghanistan is something that poses a particularly worrying kind of twist to the threat for the Central Asian countries, because it's a threat that's not directly linked to the group that's now in power, but it's another group that's kind of beyond this group that, has a narrative which is kind of intimately against their governments already, in a way that is sort of immediately threatening to them. The other sort of twist of this I'd add is that, if you go back and look at history, I mean, it's interesting to see the kind of menace from ISK in particular, how it's seen in Central Asia, is something that kind of comes and goes. Now, broadly speaking, Central Asians are sort of worried about this potential threat for some of the reasons I've kind of outlined. And we've seen in some countries that there has been a kind of visible presence of IS on the ground. Tajikistan, which you mentioned a few times in your comments, is, I think, the most prominent example of this, where we've had, a number of incidents over the past few years within the country that in some cases appear to have been linked to IS factions or groups. We had some very prominent members of the security forces in Tajikistan go and join the Islamic State. And if you go look at the sort of the fighters from Central Asia who went to fight with the Islamic State in the Levant, the Tajik community was one of the most substantial, and it was also one of the most violent and one of the most aggressive groups on the ground. There was also large numbers of Kazakhs, of Uzbeks, of Turkmen, and of Kyrgyz who went to fight as well. But the Tajik community in particular is quite notable in its kind of in both its prominence and also its violence on the ground. So you've got a particular country there that has a particularly kind of menacing link to IS, which now has potentially a growing faction next door, which might sort of accelerate that. And if we're looking at kind of Central Asian security capability to manage these potential threats, I would argue that Tajikistan is probably the one where you'd see the most kind of concerns in terms of the degree to which the government is capable of maybe mitigating its threats. And I think that is in part echoed in the fact that we've seen a real focus of attention by both Russia and China in terms of trying to bolster Tajik security capability, recognizing that this potential, weak spot exists in the kind of links from Afghanistan up into Central Asia. So, the only final point I'd add on this is that I think the ISK boogeyman, it's often quite difficult to parse from narratives that you see from Central Asia about the degree to which they are actually concerned and the degree to which you are seeing kind of rhetoric that is being a bit inflated around the organization. There is quite a long history of leaders and of Russia, the Russian government in particular, boosting the threat from the Islamic State in Central Asia and talking it up to a very high degree in Afghanistan in the past. And it's interesting, when I used to visit Central Asia, and I had the fortunate opportunity of visiting most of the capitals shortly before this disaster of COVID took over, and remember, we're all locked in our individual nations, was that in all of these places, there was a degree to which they were hesitant to really go as far and cite the numbers that you would hear cited, for example, from Moscow, because there was a degree of concern about how much they thought that this was simply a way that outside powers were trying to boost a threat on their borders to then give them a pretext and a reason to come and kind of strengthen it. And so it's always interesting to look at this ISK threat through that lens, because there's always a question within this region how much geopolitics is playing into the degree to which countries are examining these threats and responding to them. And I'll maybe stop there.
Yes, and as you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, that several Central Asian countries are willing to build relation with the Taliban. And also we already witnessed the Taliban envoy, starting with Mullah Baradar, meeting with Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi in China, in Tianjin, and subsequently meeting in Doha and in Moscow. Antonio, in your opinion, this willingness of the Taliban to engage with other countries is going locally in Afghanistan to be perceived as a kind of tarnishing their Islamist image. And this can create a driver to increase recruit and flow of local fighter to the Islamic State.
Well, I think there will be some people within the Taliban who will have reservations. They had the reservation in the past. The Taliban have had relations at the regional level for a long time. Basically, within months of starting the insurgency, they already were linking up first to Saudi Arabia. They started the first to pay some money to the Taliban because at the time they were worried about the Afghan elections. They were worried about democracy flourishing in Afghanistan. Then they were reassured by developments in Afghanistan that democracy will not flourish there. But the beginning was a concern for them. Then the Pakistanis started getting involved, and this is well known. But by 2005, the Iranians were getting involved, and later the Russians, Chinese, different stages, and so on. Several other countries. So they have got a lot of experience, and many of these engagements were controversial. The engagement with Iran caused some friction. There were some people who were hostile to the idea within the Taliban. They've always been, even now. For example, the Afghans were very critical of this, and there was one of the reasons for them starting to distance themselves from the leadership. The Afghani network recognized, they actually started the insurgency before the Quetta Shura, the Taliban, but then they joined it, they acknowledged the leadership, but then in 2007, 2008, they started distancing themselves from the Quetta Shura. And one of the reasons, there are several reasons, but one of the reasons was also their relation with Iran. And then when they established links to Russia in 2015, 16, that also was even more controversial, because whereas many Taliban accept the Islamic Republic of Iran is a kind of Islamic regime, even if there's some reservation about some aspects of it, Russia definitely is not, and Russia is seen by many, I would say the majority, probably the Taliban, as an enemy of Islam, basically on a par with America, because of course, Russia doesn't have a very great record of supporting Islamic causes. Quite the contrary, you look at, people still remember the war in Chechnya, of course, but they also remember, of course, the war in Afghanistan, and some of the older Taliban fought in that war, and also Syria, So basically, Russia's record from the point of view of many members of the Taliban is very dirty, and I think at one point, the leader Batullah, when he was pushing for these policies towards Russia, he risked his job. At one point, there was kind of revolt within the leadership, and they're very critical of him. At the end of the day, as far as the leaders are concerned, it's only a matter of time before reality and realism assert themselves. So no regime can survive in a vacuum. So they need to be able to trade. They need to keep the borders open, and they need funding. They need funding for the regime. So I think, although there are these ideological power plays going on, at the end of the day, ideology cannot survive without some kind of, connection with the reality. So I think the most extreme jihadists who think that God will provide and no compromise is needed can create a problem in the short run, but they will end up like, far left groups ended up in the 20s, after the Bolshevik Revolution. So the permanent revolution, if it is not sustainable economically, it can go on for 6 months, but then, once you run out of money, you can't keep armies going, you can keep states functioning. Then the debate shifts, and I think it will shift, and it's already shifting. And you can see that, for example, the most prominent of the equivalent, or the Afghan Taliban equivalent of the Trotskyites, so the Afghanis, are already trying to come up with a more realistic approach. And this is gradually becoming evident. So the exact terms of what they want, probably we'll never know what really is in their mind, because they don't really produce a lot of literature or whatever on this. But it's clear that they are trying to legitimize themselves and recycle themselves into some kind of mainstream. I think the real debate now within the Taliban is not between those who say jihadism till the end, or jihadism forever, and those who want to kind of reintegrate into the world, but between two different options in terms of reintegration into the world. So the old Southern Taliban leadership would like to have constructive relations with the West, also in the expectation that some money would flow. But I think also in terms of counterbalancing the power of the regional countries, which they perceive as quite prevaricating. They had quite a few brushes with Pakistan recently, but also with Iran, with China, in fact, even with almost everybody, to various degrees. And they think that having relations with Western powers would kind of a little bit counterbalance this kind of power of the regional countries, a bit like the Central Asian. The Central Asians have no ideological sympathy for the West. None of them are into liberal democracy, I would argue, but they were happy to have the Americans around in Afghanistan, contrary to the other regional countries, because they saw American presence as a way to counterbalance the power of Russia and China. So I think, the Afghan Taliban, especially the Southern Taliban, see this also as something that would benefit them. On the other hand, you have the people like the Afghans who believe that there's a risk for them, that engagement with Western powers will always come at a price, especially for them, that the price of re-engagement, the price of constructive relation, the price of keeping some flow of money going is the marginalization of people like Sirajuddin Haqqani and others who have, this kind of checkered record. And they believe that it is instead possible to build, even for them, a relationship, if not with all the regional power, at least with some of them. And of course, they can see that even Al-Qaeda, basically Al-Qaeda is the same, and Al-Qaeda supports, I think, this line. Al-Qaeda has constructive relations with the two countries in the region, Iran and Pakistan. And they believe that maybe they can, to some degree, with mixed formulas, they can extend that to other countries. Of course, there will be a price to pay, and I think they might be willing to pay it, but they believe that they can do without, the Emirate can do without the Western powers, that it is actually better for them if it does without it. And I think this is somehow encouraged by some people within the Pakistani security agencies who believe they can convince the other regional powers to accept this. And they're lobbying, the other regional powers. For now, there's not a lot of enthusiasm. The Iranians are particularly skeptical. The Iranians are now, despite having supported the ascent to power of the Taliban, now they are the most critical among the regional powers, excluding India from, India, of course, has no part in this and no relationship with the Emirate. But the Iranians are the ones who actually blocking, if you like, or delaying the recognition of the Taliban. They have a lot of reservation because they believe they've been essentially cheated by the Taliban leadership. And they have no appetite for any kind of relationship right now with the Afghans. Not just because the Afghans are Afghans, but because they see the Afghans prevaricating and actively marginalize actors even within the Taliban who are linked to Iran. So they will have a hard time to convince the Iranians. I have the impression that they have more hope that they could convince China to some kind of settlement, where, of course, the price to pay would be the Uyghurs have to disappear at least, or maybe reappear somewhere else, behind iron doors. But I think the deal is that, a bit like with Pakistan, that Al-Qaeda can and some related groups can remain in Afghanistan as long as they direct their activities elsewhere. And there were signs that the Chinese, for example, in the recent past, were becoming more supportive, for example, the Kashmiri cause. That of course was a favor to Pakistan, but something like that. Something that would try to reorient this energy, if you like, in different directions. And this is something that's not so unusual because the Iranians do it. I think the Turks have done it in various ways. Whether at the end of the day, the Chinese will trust people like the Afghans, remains to be seen. The Pakistani are lobbying very actively. They're presenting the Afghans, and there is some ground in reality for that, as much better organizers than the Southern Taliban. So if you like, the advantage of people like the Afghans from the perspective of the region is, they present themselves as somebody who actually could run a state, whereas the Southern Taliban are seen as, old guys who live in a bygone world, and they don't have a realistic approach to how to do things. So basically, the Khan says, if you really want to implement the policies that we are sponsoring as Taliban, you need the iron fist, and this idea of convincing people, talking them into accepting Sharia as they interpret it, they're not going to work in Afghanistan as it is today. You need to have essentially a totalitarian government, basically. That's the only way this is going to work, or at least a very authoritarian one. And I think this might have some appeal. I mean, maybe not now, but as the Taliban struggle to maintain order, to prevent chaos, to maintain stability, which is the main concern, in the region, then some of the countries in the region, thanks also to active Pakistani lobbying, might warm up to the idea that the lesser evil becomes somebody like the Afghans, would, of course, are forming also the alliances within the Taliban, trying to co-opt other groups as well, could be acceptable if they are willing to compromise on certain issues, and especially the issue of foreign jihadists, which is the main concern for China and Russia. So I think those could be, the line of the terms of the debate that's going on.
No, I will say that you mentioned China, so we can address the elephant in the room with foreign fighter, and especially the Uyghur. I mean, in a country like in Central Asia, like Raffaello mentioned, there is also an increased anxiety on Tajik coming back from the Middle East, on Uzbek especially. There is a group, if I recall correct, Imam Bukhari Jamaat, that is in Syria and mostly is composed by trained and battle-tested Uzbek fighter. But then again, the usual discussion with the Uyghur is how many? What is the number? How many are capable to move from the Middle East, reaching Afghanistan? And then now that Mullah Baradar underlined how it's important for the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan having Chinese Belt and Road support, then at one point, and this was a recent article from a colleague of mine here at MEI, James Dorsey, who mentioned that China is going to present the bill, and the bill will be expatriation of Uyghur fighters in Afghanistan. Is this going to happen? And this question is for both of you, Raffaello first, and then Antonio. And after this question, I just want to open the floor to the question from the public. Please feel free to use the chat function and send to MEI events your question, and then I will read to our presenter. Thank you. Raffaello, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, I had a family issue in the background. Look, I think that the China's preeminent concern with Afghanistan, with the region more broadly, is a security one, and it's a security one that's seen through the lens of Uyghur militants, and they see this particular group as a threat that has the potential to undermine, Beijing through, causing instability in Xinjiang. So this is kind of the core concern, and this is kind of the first issue that I think you see on the roster when Chinese officials engage with the region. And it's not a new concern either. If you go back to 1994, when Li Peng did his famous tour of Central Asia, where he visited all the capitals, including Mongolia, but not Dushanbe, because of course it was in the midst of a civil war at the time, Uyghurs were mentioned at most of these stops. And he said, this is our concern. And at the time, in China, there was more instability happening out in Central Asia, in Xinjiang, linked to Uyghur groups, who were angry at the kind of state that they were living under, and the Chinese would point to connections between this community and, diaspora communities that exist in Central Asia. And that's sort of been a consistent concern. And then what we see under the Taliban government, the pre-9/11 Taliban government, is that, the Chinese again lobbied the Taliban government to do something about this group, but they did it through Pakistan. And Pakistan was very much the conduit for their contacts at the time with the Taliban. Now, I think what we've seen happen as time has gone on is that, China, has develop more direct relationships with the powers that be on the ground in Afghanistan. So whereas previously they were entirely dependent, I would argue, on these links through Islamabad and their sort of very close relationship with the Pakistanis to, have the conduit and the connections to whoever was in power in Afghanistan. I think what we've seen happen over time is that they've developed a more direct relationship. And I think the important thing to note is that throughout this, Uyghurs have been a kind of a major concern from a Chinese perspective. Now, some would argue this is an exaggerated concern. It's certainly true that if you go back and look, in the past 20 years, there haven't really been many attacks you can point to confidently where there has been an incident in China that's had very clear connections to people in Afghanistan for certain. But even in neighboring countries in Pakistan or Central Asia, there has been violence in Central Asia and in Pakistan that has been in some cases potentially linked to some of these sort of Uyghur militants, but even that, it's quite difficult to pin down the details. But, putting that to one side is still a very high concern from a Chinese perspective. And what's interesting is that even during the period when you had a kind of republic government in Afghanistan, the Karzai government, and then subsequently the Ghani government, both of those governments are very willing to work with Beijing as well on trying to deal with this issue. And that sort of willingness to cooperate with Beijing has transmitted seemingly over to the Taliban, but it's not clear how much it has translated over. Rhetorically, at least, it appears as though the Taliban have said that they're willing to try to do something about this. And we've seen other factions within the kind of Taliban governance, express a willingness to do this, whether they're doing this because they, simply don't care about the Uyghurs, whether they're doing it for money, whether they're doing it for pressure from outside supporters. I think, certainly, any group that has a strong base of support in Islamabad will probably find itself under pressure by the Pakistanis to do something about this, because as I said, this is a preeminent concern for the Chinese that they will constantly be bringing up to the Pakistanis. So, there is that level, but at the same time, it is notable that if you go look and, the most recent engagement that we saw publicly between Wang Yi and Mullah Baradar in Doha recently, it was interesting that in the framing of Wang Yi's comments, the conclusion of the meeting was that they hoped and believed that the Taliban would do something about or would break links with, Uyghur militants that they would term under the phrase the East Turkestan Islamic Movement in Afghanistan, which is interesting because that, of course, suggests that, this link hasn't been broken yet, even though there has been a lot of lobbying to do something about it. And I think what we can translate this into is really that there is a tension within the Taliban about what to do about this, and how much to be willing to actually do about it. And there have been stories that have emerged from Afghanistan that the Taliban have sought to move these sorts of communities of Uyghurs away from the kind of border regions with China in a way of sort of placating the Chinese. There have been other stories that have emerged where, there's been sort of very heavy pressure from Chinese intelligence and Chinese security forces going to Kabul to lobby and going to Islamabad to lobby, proxies or directly, elements in the new Taliban administration about this problem. So there's a lot of sort of focus on this particular issue. And it's very clear that this is where the Chinese are leaning into very heavily. And it's not clear that there is a sort of clear answer there. I think the other side to your sort of your point was this question about, a potential for Belt and Road investment, the potential for money, and China being seen as kind of this, money spigot, which will open up and, sort of release vast, volumes of dollars and wealth and yuan into Afghanistan and sort of transform the country. I think that's still quite far off, frankly. But I think what's interesting is that whoever's in power in Kabul will see this golden bucket at the end of the rainbow. Whenever they're engaging with the Chinese, this will always be on the horizon because ultimately China is Afghanistan's richest and most influential neighbor with which it shares a direct border. And that will always be the case, no matter who's in charge in Afghanistan, this will always be true. And so there's always going to be incentive for whoever's in power in Kabul to try to have some sort of functioning relationship with the Chinese and to find a way of accommodating these sorts of particular Chinese concerns, as complicated as they may be. To sort of finally touch on the complexity question within the Taliban around this issue, I think that there are different perspectives. I think, as I said before, any faction within the Taliban that has very close links to Islamabad will find itself under great pressure to do something about this because it is such a major Chinese concern. But when you get to some of the other groups, I think there's other issues that come into play. And I think one big issue is the reality that in some cases, these Uyghur fighters have been fighting with the Taliban for 20 years or more. So these aren't just a kind of alien group that just sort of arrived yesterday and, they're sort of immediately dispensable. I mean, they're married in, they're part of the community, they're part of the fabric of the Taliban, and they fought alongside them for a long time. And ultimately, the Taliban just won the war, And so from their perspective, they've been delivered this wonderful victory. Why should they immediately turn on the allies that they fought together with to just, dispense with them because of these, groups outside, these kafir countries, neighboring countries who weren't really supporting them before anyway? Why should they just throw them under the bus in advance of these other countries who seem to have much more sort of fickle relationships with them? The only final point around that is, of course, the fact that, the Taliban don't just have, Uyghur groups that they force alongside all this time. There are other groups, other factions within the organization as well. It's a relatively, I think, homogenous and hierarchical structure within the Taliban, but there are factions. And the concern always will be if the core is willing to just kind of throw a faction under a bus at request of someone external, what might that mean for others? Others might suddenly feel, well, hang on, is our position as secure as we think? Or is it possible that we might also get thrown under the bus as well when the winds change or when it's important to some sort of external partner that the core, turns against us? So I think there's a lot of issues at play here that mean this will always be a kind of issue. And I think we can see that it is still an issue that will sort of hang heavy over this. The only final point I'd add here was, the idea was mentioned in some of Antonio's comments, and I think in some of the parts that you picked up, Alessandro, that, the Chinese would sort of lean in to recognize the Taliban. I think this is one thing that I have heard fairly consistently from, Chinese interlocutors have been able to engage with recently and since the fall of Kabul, is that, Beijing's not going to be the first. China is certainly not going to be the first country to stand up and say, we formally acknowledge the Taliban government and, all the things, trappings that go with that. I mean, they are essentially de facto engaging with it as a government in Afghanistan already. Their foreign minister is meeting with the Taliban's putative foreign minister and deputy, prime minister. Say, there is a kind of de facto recognition that's already happening. But I think the formal component of it, I don't think China will be the first to go forwards and do that, because that would just suggest the level of ownership over Afghanistan's future and what the Taliban might be doing there, which I don't think Beijing wants to take responsibility for, aware that, this is potentially quite an unstable government and an unstable situation that they're stepping into, and they don't want to be the ones sort of left holding the bag. I'll stop there.
Antonio, the floor is yours. The same question, and there's one that I think Raffaello covered very widely. So the question is on the future. Are the Taliban throwing the Uyghur under the bus, yes or no?
Yeah, they say, current estimates of the number of Uyghurs there in Afghanistan coming from their hosts largely are that there are maybe 60 to 80 of them with Islamic State. The number has been reducing, in part because of casualties. Also, people have been leaving. Where they're going, I don't know, but there's been an outflow. And general demoralization of this Uyghur in Afghanistan in the last couple of years, and the group that is affiliated with Al Qaeda is estimated to be around 150 men, and there might be some who were with Islamic State who moved back to Al Qaeda affiliated groups like the ATIM, which has not merged with the Islamic State, and actually the ATIM itself was leaning towards Islamic State, but then drifted back towards Al Qaeda, like some other Central Asian groups in the last year or two, as a result, of course, of the decline of the Islamic State image after the fall of the Caliphate, the fall of Mosul, Iraq, etc. So in total, probably just over 200 of them, so not big numbers. And they tend to be, or they used to be based until very recently, together with other Central Asians, actually mixing together in Kastak Valley of Badakhshan, which is a remote place, which has been outside government control for a long time, and is no man's land even now. Although the Taliban have access, but they don't actually control it. There are overall several hundreds of Central Asians and Uyghurs there. and the mix, the intermingle, you know, basically Islamic State and Islamic State, there isn't much difference on the ground, you know, they're all sharing the same space. Sources within the what used to be the government of Afghanistan, the Islamic Republic, say that just before the fall of Kabul, a key, very important Taliban leader in Badakhshan approached the government asking for help in getting the Uyghurs out. So basically was saying, you know, we know what is coming, you know, there is pressure to hand them over to Pakistan, who will then hand them over to China. We cannot prevent that. But basically what's going to happen is they're not going to, of course, go to Pakistan. They will rather join the Islamic State. It was talking about the pro-Al-Qaeda ones, you know, the ones who are not already in the Islamic State. But we want to get them out, you know. It's not their first option to go to the Islamic State. They're tired. They want to, you know, retire, so to speak, from the jihad. But of course, the Chinese will still imprison them or whatever. So going there is not an option. They would like to go anywhere, even to the States, Turkey, wherever, but wherever takes them, they're willing to go. Can you help? So basically, you had this commander was actually usually seen as close to Al-Qaeda, approaching the government, asking to get these people out, possibly even America, which is quite, you know, quite a step to take. And of course, then Kabul fell, so nothing happened, you know, but that already gives a sense of the fact that already within the Taliban, already at the stage, this was seen as coming. You know, the pressure from China was already felt. Then after the fall, the pressure, of course, increased further, and Taliban sources in Kastak say that they did go. In fact, one of my researchers spoke to one of the one of my researchers managed to speak to a commander of the Taliban, who was one of those who went to Kastak to basically tell the Uyghurs, you need to move, you need to come with us, we need to relocate you away from the Tajik border, away from the Chinese border, and maybe you should also hand over your weapons to us. And there was basically a upsurge of, you know, a revolt, basically. Not only the Uyghurs didn't want to follow, but the Central Asian Kastak were totally against, you know, and also some senior Taliban commanders intervened and requested the leadership to to freeze this operation, because the Central Asian, as Rafaelo pointed out, fought, you know, apart from this kind of solidarity with the Uyghurs, the comrade in arms, but also they felt we are next. You know, if we allow the Uyghurs to be deported to China, or even, you know, marginalized, disarmed, whatever, it's obvious that then, you know, the Chinese, the Russians, the Central Asian governments will put pressure on the Taliban to do the same with us. You know, what prevents them from going down that route? So that was frozen. You see, the Uyghurs have moved, possibly because they don't want to be within reach of the Taliban. Where they're gone is not clear. But I think it's pretty clear that the option that these commanders who actually have a relation also with the Afghans, you know, with Al-Qaeda and the Afghans, Taliban commanders, is realistically, we won't be able to resist China's pressure forever, because China is not just China. You know, the Russians will support the Chinese view. The Pakistanis will not be able to resist, because the Chinese will certainly keep pressure on the Pakistanis very much. And the Central Asian states, of course, are not going to show any sympathy for the Uyghurs, not for the Central Asians. So, you know, realistically, the Emirate sooner or later has to give up. So their option is, you know, let's get them out. You know, let's buy time, delay things until we manage to relocate them. And then, of course, China won't like it, but it's a kind of fait accompli. You know, once they're gone, and the Chinese will be upset at the beginning, but then, you know, we'll have to deal with us and settle for a jihadist-free Afghanistan, you know, and we believe that these guys are probably ready for retirement. You know, if there are a lot of them in Turkey, so if we're able to go to Turkey, probably they would be quite there, maybe do some fundraising, some kind of activities in support of the cause, but they wouldn't be too dangerous to China anyway. So I think this is a line that even Al-Qaeda is sponsoring. Al-Qaeda, as I mentioned, the Afghans know that some kind of compromise will be needed, at least at the regional level. I think, they are not going to hand them over. It's impossible for them to hand them over because there will be betrayal of the cause or completely discredit Al-Qaeda, Khan, etc. But the other option is just getting them out, getting them out, disappear them somewhere in some safe place. And I think that the route they're going to take, and maybe they're already doing it because, as I said, the Uyghurs seem to have moved. Where they moved, I don't know, and probably they're not going to tell us, but maybe they're already on their way out. They will take time. It will have to be, small groups moving. It's not going to be a simple operation to relocate them. But I think realistically is the only option that would work for them. So whereas within the Taliban, there are those who think, we could gain so much in terms of external support if we were more, willing to hand over some of these guys, or maybe in a disguised way, have them captured by somebody. You don't need to advertise the kind of things as it happen, or having some bomb falling on their head, from some mysterious drone or mysterious plane. So there are also this kind of position, but basically in Badakhshan, the Southern Taliban don't have much leverage. They don't have much influence. They're a minority, their supporters. So I don't think they actually have the ability to implement their policy. And this is another selling point for people like Sirajuddin. We're telling, the region, at the end of the day, you don't like us. You have a relation with the other guys, but the other guys can't do much, for you because they talk a lot, they drink a lot of tea, they talk a lot. But when it comes to action, in Badakhshan or in the southeast or in the east, they really don't have much power to do things because we are in charge. To be honest, we're charging Kabul too, So, let's face the reality. We are the ones who have to negotiate with, and you have to make a deal with us. I think this is essentially the message.
And now I think that we can open the floor to the question. We have received more than 11 questions, and the first one is for Raffaello. And Raffaello said in his opening remarks that there is a regret, I think that was the word used, in Central Asia over the Taliban takeover. Can we widen it and get his perspective? Particularly US rivals practically gloated a few months ago. What do you think they are now being forced to confront China, Russia, Pakistan?
I mean, I think that, there is there's always an interesting dichotomy, if you will, when you look at even actually China's perspective on Afghanistan when it was, ruled by the Republic. On the one hand, there was a kind of degree of concern that the United States had this kind of forward operating base, military operating base right on their borders. That was, fighting. It had big presence, thousands of men, sophisticated technology. There was this presence sitting right there, which, they always worried, well, this could be used against us potentially as well. But this was balanced against the kind of other side of the coin, which is, well, at least someone else is there kind of dealing with the problem. Because they looked and they said, well, Afghanistan's got a pretty long history of being chaotic, of having instability, of having terrorist groups fighting within it, creating problems for neighboring countries. On the basis of that, if someone else is there kind of keeping a lid on that pot, great, So there was always this kind of balance, and it kind of depended the moments at which you saw it swing one way or the other way, or one way or the other, And so, I would argue that when, under President Obama, you started to get the discussion of first the surge and then the withdrawal that was due to follow. You saw after that moment, you saw an increase in Chinese particular efforts and attention to try to strengthen their presence and their protection in some way, and their kind of security footprint around that region. And this was to try to mitigate the potential dangers and threats that were sort of coming out, or that they thought might start suddenly emanating from Afghanistan. So, you had this the swing, and there you saw the swing go particularly strongly in that direction. And in some ways that was echoed around the region, where you saw around the region, people started thinking, oh crap, if the Americans are going, what does this mean? You know, and oh, do we need to start to prepare? Do we need to start to worry? But then the Americans didn't leave. And so at that point, you saw their concerns scale back again. And so then you started to see instead this rising sense of potential concern that maybe, you know, the Americans are here for ulterior reasons. This is a forward deployment base to ultimately try to come and cause trouble for us. And for the Central Asians in particular, you know, they always worried about, you know, color revolutions, which is a concern that they share with the Russians in particular, but also with the Chinese. And it's this fear that, you know, popular uprisings will overthrow the kind of established order in these countries. And, you know, they had a history for this when you go back and look at in 2005, yes, it was 2005 when you had this, you had an incident in Andijan where there was a kind of a small local rebellion, and the Uzbek forces sort of gunned down a crowd and hundreds were killed. And this led to very sharp criticisms from the Western governments about what the Uzbeks were doing. And it led to the sort of ejection of American military bases from Uzbekistan that were being used in Kashi Kanabad. You know, and then to 2010, when you had a kind of uprising in Kyrgyzstan, which the West kind of said was great and was going to, you know, a democratic order reestablish itself, you know, and this kind of push towards kind of, you know, instability in the region, or basically overturning of the established order, was always a kind of concern that lingered in the Central Asians' minds. And so having a kind of American security footprint right on their border gave them a sense of concern that maybe this could be used to help, you know, create instability there. But as I say, it's always a balance that goes back and forwards. And I think what you've seen since the kind of fall of Kabul to the Taliban is actually a willingness by the Central Asians to sort of play a game where they appear to want to let the Americans or Western presence kind of still be there in some sort of way. And you let them continue to allow this kind of narrative flow that Washington is talking to, particularly the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, about maybe using their countries as some sort of forward operating base. I've heard very little from the ground that this is actually happening, but certainly I wouldn't, it's possible. And, you know, and certainly the Americans had given, you know, substantial security support to Tajik police forces over the past few years, to border forces over the past few years. They support a lot of missions through the OSCE, through UNODC, through others, to help kind of strengthen security footprints on the ground. And the locals appreciate this because it's sort of helping them. And it's also broadening the options that they have, so they don't have to just rely on either Russian security presence or now an increasing kind of Chinese one. So there's always a desire to, you know, cultivate and welcome a kind of American presence, but it's always balanced against a concern of how far that might go and what might it ultimately sort of lead to. And I think going forwards, you're going to continue to see that kind of tension and balance play out, both internally because of concerns there, but also because of, I think, Russian and Chinese concerns, which I think are going to become more acute going forwards.
Thank you, Raffaello. And now I have two questions from Antonio, and I will put the question together. The first is from Max. You mentioned the global agenda of IS Khorasan. What is your outlook on the future development of the organization? Will it develop into an external threat outside Afghanistan? And how much are the Taliban really in control of Afghanistan? And it links with the other question. Antonio, you were recently quoted in Reuters article saying ISK are trying to undermine and discredit the Taliban Emirate. The Emirate promised security and they are trying to show they can deliver it. What do you see as the eventual outcome of this struggle? The article also went on to quote some concern in the West over these developments. What options are open to them beside the over-the-horizon effort which Biden proposed and everyone has since read it?
Well, of course, the Islamic State in principle always has a global agenda. And even if Khorasan now is actually fighting for its survival, you know, because, you know, they know perfectly well, and I think they're right, that if they allow the Taliban to consolidate a little bit and to kind of resolve some of the financial issues, at least next spring, you know, when, you know, now we are going towards winter, and in many of the areas where the Islamic State has got its bases, in the valleys, in the mountains, there's no, you know, basically access is even harder than usual, so it's not the time to go on a military offensive anyway. But next spring, after the snow melts, in all likelihood, the Emirate will be in a position to crush the bases, you know, the headquarters of the Islamic State in Khorasan. Now, the Islamic State largely operate now as an underground asymmetric forces, the guerrilla force essentially, contrary to what it used to do in the past. In the past, it was doing like conventional battles in the east for control, for territorial control. In the last couple of years, it's given up on that, but it still needs bases, for training camps at courses where to run its admin, its finance, and these are now the main base now is in Nuristan, which is the most remote part of Afghanistan. They had a base in Badakhshan, which has been moved out because they fear that it's very exposed now. And centrally, they fear that the Russians, together with Taliban, might want to go after that because its course is in Kazakh Valley and is very much in the aim of the Russians and the Chinese. So they're afraid about a joint campaign or some airstrikes plus Taliban forces moving up the valley. They fear they wouldn't be able to resist. And that's why they moved to a more remote area like Nuristan. They also have some bases near Nuristan in Kunar, in the upper valleys. So these are bases that are essential. They can't operate without some kind of, the leaders have to be somewhere. They can't be hiding in actually when they try to do that, Azan Faruqi was captured in a flat in Kandahar. So it's not viable for them to keep the leaders hiding in the cities. Sooner or later will be captured. They need to have camps under their own military control, and that's where most of the forces concentrate. Most of their men are now defending these bases. So for the Islamic State, the priority is surviving. Now it's seen as being on the offensive. It is on the offensive, but it's because they think, if we don't attack now and we don't preempt the consolidation of the emirate, we are finished. They will crush us. They will destroy our bases. They can do that. And they know that because the Taliban at that point would be able to concentrate their best units as they did in 2019-20, where they destroyed captured the previous headquarters of the Islamic State in Nangar, and that was also in a very difficult location where the Americans couldn't get. The Americans sent the special forces in support of the Afghan army to take those bases, but they never managed to completely take Muband Valley in Nangar. The Taliban did, so the understanding within the Islamic State is, we need to spend our residual energy basically to go on the offensive to undermine the emirate. And undermining means simply discrediting it. They're also trying to provoke the Taliban into some kind of indiscriminate repression, and that may work because, for example, now clearly the emirate is running death squads in eastern Afghanistan, hunting Islamic State cells, but of course in the process they also hang a few probably innocent people. They're executing people without trials, so there's always leading to abuses and let's call it arbitrary executions, and also the targeting of the Zara community. Clearly the Islamic State is trying to push them towards arming themselves for self-protection. The Taliban will not allow that. The Taliban will not allow the Hazara community to form its own army or militia independent of the Taliban, also because the relation between Hazaras and Emirate are not good either. So if they try to do that, the Taliban would react. They would crush them. And then, of course, could be one further step towards, some kind of wider insurgency, which will not be related at all to the Islamic State, but doesn't matter for the Islamic State if other insurgencies start as a relief, because then the Taliban would have to disperse their forces and won't be able to focus their energy against the Islamic State. And at the same time, of course, they're trying to discredit the Taliban in the eyes of potential donors and supporters as a force that can bring stability to Afghanistan. They're trying to make some of these countries that they see as likely to provide support for the emirate doubt that the emirate is actually the vehicle that could implement or defend their interests. Like, for example, sending a Uyghur suicide bomber to blow up a Shia mosque in Kunduz, I think is a signal, to the Chinese, that these guys actually can deliver what you need. And therefore, they're trying to delay, the moment when this kind of support starts flowing. Probably they can delay it forever, but the more they delay, the more they can buy time, the more they can the offensive can keep going, and the more the Taliban will be constrained in their ability to react. Because, for example, if the Taliban were getting more support from the outer world, they could do better in terms of rehabilitating some kind of air force. And then, taking these remote mountain valleys would be easy with helicopters ferrying supplies and troops, to behind actually Islamic State lines, for example. So there are many ways, where even delaying the delivery of support can give more breathing space for the Islamic State to do its thing. So yes, definitely, the Islamic State is trying to undermine the emirate, because they see that now is the time, that post-revolutionary, if you like, consolidation will follow one way or another, and that will be very bad for the Islamic State. In terms of the threat that the Islamic State poses beyond Afghanistan, because now there's so much focus on surviving, protecting their headquarters and their core areas and the leadership inside the country, I don't think that's a priority. And I don't think the priority is doing something in Central Asia or whatever. First of all, it's very difficult, because in moving people across the Tajik border is very hard. You can move some people, but probably in the range of tens per year. So that way you don't start really a jihad in Tajikistan on this basis. Also, they don't have that many people. The Islamic State sources admit that in the entire Central Asia, they have several hundred members, but that means not only people who can blow things up, but also, recruiters, logisticians, support elements. So basically, between Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan is not a lot, having 700-800 members in total. It means that probably the people can do things are 50 or 100 between three countries, so it's not, a force that can start a significant jihad or campaign in Central Asia. Maybe the occasional attack, yes, but not much more than that. So the capabilities are limited, and they would have to invest a lot of resources, to move cards into Central Asia would imply losses, because some of them would be caught, would be detected. And right now they think that these guys are more useful in protecting the Islamic State inside Afghanistan. Same with Iran. Iran centrally would be very good to strike in Iran, because that brings money. There are people in the Gulf who get very excited every time something is blown up in Iran, and therefore they would be willing to support the Islamic State if they could demonstrate capacity to do further attacks. They did in the past, but now for years they've not been able to do anything. If they could do something, it would be beneficial for the Islamic State. They would certainly bring funding, but it's not that simple, because to move people into Iran is not as simple. You can't do operation across the border in Baluchistan, but to strike at substantial targets in Tehran or at the center of the Islamic Republic is much more difficult. And when they did it once, they suffered quite a lot of losses afterwards in terms of cards and support structure being detained, executed, and whatever. So they don't have the ability nor have the priority of doing that much in these areas. Pakistan is different, and to be honest, I'm not totally sure why they established this Vilayat Pakistan at a time when Khorasan was already struggling, because that reduced the amount of funding going to Khorasan, and also quite a lot of people of Khorasan Province were moved to Vilayat Pakistan. And then they started operation there that actually undermined the relationship, the tolerance, so to speak, that the Pakistani services had for the Islamic State in Khorasan. Of course, when the Pakistani army saw the Islamic State was carrying out operation inside Pakistan, they started wondering whether it was the right vehicle to put pressure on the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Now that the Islamic Republic is gone, they don't really have any reason for supporting or even tolerating Islamic State activities, and they've been clamping down on their camps inside Pakistan. So it's quite surprising. Probably, I would imagine there's a line of funding there that somebody has opened, for sectarian attacks in Pakistan. I believe there are people in the Gulf again who believe that there's worthy cause, but that actually has been detrimental to the cause of Khorasan. So that's where they can play a role, in Pakistan. But again, I think that they're probably going to keep the resources in Afghanistan. In fact, they moved people out of Pakistan into Afghanistan to defend their bases. They had at one point 2,000 men in Pakistan, but half of them at least have moved back to Afghanistan to help, shore up the defense of their bases. So I think they are, we have to, the main point, survival now is a priority for them, because of course if they get smashed, then all these other nice campaigns, jihads they talk about in the region, they're not going to happen. You don't even have a leadership, you don't have any logistics, all of these things are going to die. How are you going to infiltrate Central Asia if you don't have any more presence in Afghanistan? So it's all dependent on that. Iran is also infiltrated from the Kurdistan side, but Central Asia can only be infiltrated from Afghanistan. In China, I think very little goes on in terms of infiltration there, but if it was to happen, it would have to come from Afghanistan. So, so in terms of projecting any threat beyond the region, that I think is science fiction. I think the Islamic State, if the Islamic State has assets that can carry out attacks in Europe, I don't see why they would send them to Afghanistan. I mean, if they exist, they're in Syria, in Turkey, maybe in West Africa. Why would I, from West Africa or from Syria, from Turkey, send somebody to Afghanistan if my target is Europe? I mean, it's much better to keep them where they are. The access will be much easier, and probably they are less at risk of being killed. So unless these cards have some role to play in the defense or in a campaign against the Emirate, but if there are trained cells who can carry out sophisticated attacks, terrorist attacks, say in Europe, I mean, if I was a European security policymaker, I would be relieved if they move to Afghanistan, because it means they probably are going to be used somewhere else, not in Europe. So I think the Americans are different, because the Americans have this obsession, especially politicians. For them, even the suspicion that something happened in America could be originated somehow, have something to do with Afghanistan, send them crazy. Because of the 9/11 heritage, that is an obsession they have. And anything up in America, probably somebody, if the Democrats are in power, probably Fox News will allege that it came from Afghanistan. If the Republicans are in power, it will be CNN. But because of the politics there being very partisan, I think there will always be allegations, regardless of the evidence, that something somehow Afghanistan is involved. But in practical terms, doing attacks in America, why do I need Afghanistan? The 2001 was different, because Al Qaeda didn't have this wide network. The Islamic State didn't even exist. Now both of them have assets and presence in areas where access to Europe in particular, but also America, will be much easier. I think if you are a Turkish member of either organization with a Turkish passport, it's much easier to get sent it to Europe. You don't need to do much, but even to America, why would I need an Afghan to do that? Yes, they could use some of this flow of refugees to infiltrate people, but do I want to send skilled CAD to Europe in the hope that somehow they get neutralized? And to be honest, many of these people will actually make it, because the gates are already closing down. So people who are being evacuated have a record of working for the government, working for foreign embassies or foreign organizations. It is possible, I suppose, to infiltrate somebody there, but the gate is already closed. The people who got the papers, I've got the papers. Now, doing it now is going to be difficult. Perhaps not impossible. Perhaps they can smuggle somebody through. But to be honest, having probably thousands of members in Turkey, I think gives, if everybody has to worry about these things, better worry about Turkey than about Afghanistan.
And I received another question, is not addressed, but I think Rafaelo will be the right person, because the question is, should Singapore be more worried now?
I mean, I think, it's a very appropriate question for an audience and for an institution like MEI based in the US. I mean, look, I think that there is clearly more instability now in Afghanistan and in its kind of immediate neighborhood. And it has clearly changed a dynamic there. And it has created a context where, frankly, militant groups are more likely to be able to operate once again. And if we go back and look at history, we can see that 9/11, did produce, 9/11 was produced in this context in the past. And I know it's always, as Antonio correctly points out in some ways, 9/11 was a particular marker and a particular incident. And for the whole chain of events that led to that particular incident to replicate themselves would be difficult to happen once again. But it did happen. And there was, of course, echoes from that, which did happen in Southeast Asia. So there is a degree to which I can understand why concerns might be elevated. But I would also say that the context is totally different. The awareness and understanding of how threats can emanate out from a place like Afghanistan and echo in the West or echo in a place like Singapore are very different, frankly. You know what I mean? And our security capability has changed. Our security forces are much more attuned to these threats and much more attuned to be able to watch out for them. I think the part that people should worry about more is how much this instability is going to spill into into its immediate neighborhood, and how much that chaos might then cause, concatenations of problems, which might ultimately echo elsewhere. I think that's the kind of preeminent side of the threat picture I would see. But I think, immediately sitting in Singapore, I don't think there's much reason to get more preoccupied now than you maybe were previously before the fall of Kabul, because ultimately events in Afghanistan are far from here, frankly, and the connections are quite limited. I would also very briefly like to touch on the kind of broader potential for the ISK threat to come out, because I agree entirely with Antonio. Again, the whole chain of events which would have to happen for, a cell from Islamic State in Khorasan to make it to Europe, to make it to the United States, to make it to Singapore, to launch a kind of large-scale sophisticated attack along the lines of, heaven forbid, what we saw on 9/11, or even something along the lines of what we saw in Paris or London or Madrid or something like that, or even Bali, it's quite a long chain. A lot of things have to happen before that actually happens, right? But I think what I would point to is an observation that we see particularly in Europe, which is that if you go back and look over the past few years, and I think going back to maybe 2016, there have been a couple of incidents in Europe where we've either had a terrorist attack, there's an incident in Stockholm, or there was a network in Germany of Tajiks who were talking to people who were linked to the Islamic State in Afghanistan. And these guys were talking to each other. Now, it's not clear the degree to which ISK was directing these guys to launch attacks, or how much these guys were just talking to IS, and it happened to be IS in Khorasan Province because, the Central Asians were there and these are the people they were communicating with. But there have been some links off the battlefield. But it is more in terms of this kind of new form of threat that you can see, which is fighters talking to each other. And so within that context, you can see the potential for an incident to take place. I think Europe is probably the most obvious one immediately, because we've got a track record of it there. And there is, if you go look at the last sort of networks, the large scale worrying networks that have been disrupted in Europe, they have had links to kind of former Soviet communities, networks from the Balkans, with links to networks from the Caucasus, with links to networks from Central Asia, who do tend to have more connections potentially to Afghan and ISK than others. You have seen some sort of connections there that have ultimately, led to attacks. And I'm thinking now of the, Vienna attack in 2020, which was from this sort of community of, first or second generation Balkans and Caucasians living in Europe, some of whom had links to, IS in Syria, but also IS in Afghanistan. So there is that potential threat that could emerge, but I think that's very different to the sort of threat that I think people often conceptualize, which is, a group of 5 guys trained in a camp somewhere in, Nuristan, and then sent back with sort of marching orders to launch some sort of large scale attack somewhere. That is, I think, far off. The only final point I'd add on this is a comment on the kind of American particular perspective, because recently we saw, I think, the Assistant Secretary or Deputy Secretary for Policy, Colin Carl, put a 6-month timeline on the potential ISK threat coming, hitting the mainland. And I just add a point of, comment on that particular reference, which is, it's worth looking at those comments in detail, because he doesn't say in 6 months ISK will attack us. what he says is that it would roughly take 6 months for ISK to develop the capability to potentially attack us. But what he also says is, of course, we are keeping pressure on the group directly, as well as trying to indirectly through others. And, the point would be that 6-month timeline only exists if nothing else happens. And of course, a lot else is happening, which is a lot of external pressure and a lot of attention by the United States to make sure that this threat doesn't mature. And I think the 6-month timeline is offered in counter to the 1-year timeline that they put, 1 to 2 years timeline that they put on AQ. And I think that's more connected to the fact that I think the United States has a kind of probably deeper understanding of penetration and overwatch of AQ networks and potential threats that might emanate from that, whereas they don't necessarily have that same sort of developed capability yet with ISK. So I think it's always worth remembering that when we see officials, security officials give these kinds of numbers and timelines, it's really more a reflection of their capability rather necessarily than a reflection of the exact nature of when the threat is going to strike. So I just want to throw that briefly in. Thank you.
Yes, as you mentioned, and also the US predicted the Afghan National Army was able to resist alone for 3 years, or worst case scenario, 18 months. If I recall correct, was 11 days. So having said that, I move to a question for Antonio from my colleague James Dorsey. Can Antonio talk about the different in Taliban relationship with different militant groups, including Al-Qaeda, Taliban Pakistan, and other Pakistani-based groups?
Well, there is no unified Afghan Taliban approach to any of these groups. Simplifying a little bit, the Southern Taliban are the ones who were trying to formulate a policy of, if you like, reforming their relationship with the foreign jihadis in general. And that includes not only the Pakistani Al-Qaeda, but also the Central Asians and the others. And that started after they signed this agreement with Americans in February 2020. And it took some time to formulate it, whereby the summer they were proposing, they're offering revised agreements with all of these groups. They had agreements before. The revised agreements were tightening control over these groups, and they were highlighting the need for these groups to relocate in some cases and register the members, not only the groups, but every single member with the Taliban, and also come under Taliban control in terms of movement. So basically, if they wanted to leave their assigned area of residence, they had to authorize the movement with the Taliban leadership. So quite tight control over them. So the deal basically was, you are granted asylum in Afghanistan under the Emirate, but you have to give up on your exporting jihad from Afghanistan towards, well, wherever, Very few groups accepted that, the faction of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, which is in the northwest, accepted it also because they didn't have much of a choice. They are completely embedded in the Taliban. They live in Taliban camps. They have families with them, so they're not mobile. They were not in a position to migrate from the area, so they signed the agreement. And also Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which is one of these Pakistani groups, which has uneasy, so to speak, relations with the Pakistani government, is not in a position to say, we don't like the Taliban, we go back to Pakistan, because some of them will be prosecuted there. There are different factions, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, different individuals. Sometimes they cooperate with the Pakistanis. Some of them are, they would be probably put in jail if they went back. So they also signed because they felt that it's better to have a safe haven in Afghanistan. So basically the 400 or 500 Lashkar-e-Jhangvi members in Afghanistan are people who have issues. They've done things that they would probably lead them to jail in Pakistan. There are many others who are in Pakistan. They're okay because they're not broken Pakistani law. They're not, crossed the path of the Pakistani security services. And then the other group that signed was Lashkar-e-Taiba, another Pakistani group. But Lashkar-e-Taiba, for them, it was just a symbolic agreement because basically Lashkar-e-Taiba doesn't need to be in Afghanistan. It's only in Afghanistan to support the Taliban on the request of the Taliban themselves and of the Pakistani security services, so they can go back to Pakistan whenever they want. In fact, at the time when they signed, there were not that many inside Afghanistan. Then a lot went into Afghanistan during the final campaign of the Taliban against the Islamic Republic. I understand that some of them are going back. They don't have a problem in Pakistan at all. Like, they have very good relations with the Pakistani security service. So I think they signed the agreement basically to provide a good example that the Taliban could advertise, look, Lashkar-e-Taiba signed, you should sign as well. But they didn't need any agreement because the long-term plan is to leave Afghanistan altogether. They don't need to be there at all. The other groups, including Al-Qaeda, some groups flatly refuse even to discuss, like Imam Bukhari Jamaat, they refuse. Some other groups bought time, that the TTP, Al-Qaeda didn't say no, but they said not disagreement, but let's keep talking. They really didn't want to sign, but at the same time didn't want to alienate the Taliban for obvious reasons. Then what happened is that the US-Taliban agreement started getting lost. Basically, the two sides start accusing each other of non-compliance. The timeline of the withdrawal became unclear. So the Taliban stopped trying to push this agreement through, and nothing was heard about them after the summer. There was no pressure on this group to sign. And now what you see now is something new, that the Southern Taliban are actually happy to have the TTP there as a tool of pressure on Pakistan. Relations are very good with the Pakistanis, so the Southern Taliban think they need some leverage in negotiating with them. Whereas the Afghans have been asked by the Pakistani authorities to mediate between them and TTP, and this mediation is now going on. And as you know, yesterday a ceasefire was agreed for a month, and some prisoners are being released. So there is this kind of dichotomy where the TTP feels closer to the Southern Taliban, but at the same time, they can say no to the Afghans. And some Southern Taliban have broken ranks and also came out in support of the negotiations or a compromise. So I would say a bit like, I said before with the Uyghurs, the solution that the Afghans would, and probably Al-Qaeda would promote for the foreign jihadis is some kind of either settlement or migration where possible. So in the case of Pakistan, it would be a settlement, and they would probably kind of encourage both sides to agree on the tribal areas of Pakistan becoming, Islamized, so to speak, and that would also help the Afghans because it would create some kind of, strategic debt for themselves, but also would advertise the Afghans as, again, the guys who have the solution, a solution that, well, maybe doesn't make everybody that happy, but a solution that, is the only possible compromise. If the Pakistanis were willing to accept this, that could be a template for other solutions, for other negotiated schemes where the foreign jihadis somehow they are sorted. And I think that's where they're going. Al-Qaeda, I think, agrees with this. Al-Qaeda doesn't particularly need to be in Afghanistan. The lead is actually in Pakistan. The leaders of Al-Qaeda Central, of course, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic subcontinent is to some degree a different thing, but I think the leaders in that case are also in Pakistan. There's some kind of understanding with the Pakistani authorities, and the understanding is you don't do anything here, maybe help a little bit trying to sort out relations between Islamabad and various jihadist groups. If you do something, you do it in India or in Kashmir, okay? So on that terms, which are not ideal for Al-Qaeda, but it works, similar to the agreement they have with the Iranians, where the Iranians say, we don't do anything here. If you do something in Saudi Arabia, very good. Maybe some other places, but as long as you don't do it here, it's fine. And maybe sometimes they can also help them if there is some shared interest. So this is the model, I think, that they are following. Al-Qaeda, anyway, is a very small organization itself. It's all based, it's a bit like the Comintern, it's an organization of cadres whose job is to advise and train jihadist groups. Then the impact can vary from place to place, but a bit like the Comintern, had a lot of influence on Indian nationalists against the British Empire. Yeah, the 3 people advising the Congress, and had a lot of influence over them. And some of the ideology of the Congress party came also from there, the socialist component. So that is a kind of idea, basically you to transfer know-how, organizational know-how, if you like, ideological know-how, how to come up with a coherent ideology, which is not always that easy. That's the role. And if you look at the papers from Abbottabad, is what the Al-Qaeda guys were doing when the Pakistani jihadis with the Taliban were trying to do, because not all of them were so receptive. And TTP initially was not so receptive. They found a lot of problems in trying to kind of, coach them. Now with the current leadership, it seems to be that they found this kind of alignment. And I think it's Al-Qaeda's interest, also because they're under pressure from the Pakistani authorities as well, to kind of bring TTP back into the fold, Of course, they also would like, some concession to be made with the TTP to make this workable. The Taliban in general have good relation with Lashkar-e-Taiba, and the Lashkar-e-Taiba has actually helped them a lot, sending more than 10,000 volunteers to fight in May, June, July, August. Some are still there, and some have been fighting also against the Islamic State, so they've been quite supportive. And then there are, of course, a variety of other groups, some of which have helped the Taliban in the past, then they have disappeared. Jaish-e-Mohammed has not been seen recently. It's not clear what happened to them, but they used to have people in Afghanistan, but they not participated in the recent fighting. Right now, the Taliban have relations only with TTP, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and Lashkar-e-Taiba, and they are good relations. And they're trying to be, so to speak, constructive in this relationship, but the issue remains how to reach some kind of settlement at the regional level, how to deal with these groups, when they are opposed to their own governments.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And I think I have to apologize with the audience because I have still several questions to ask to both Raffaello and Antonio, but we arrived at the end of our time. And I just want to thank our 2 presenters and our audience for being with us. Thank you and enjoy a great day. Bye.